Hello my dear friends, and welcome back to another Acolyte breakdown. Today we're talking about the penultimate episode, Episode 7, Choice. The original leaked title for this episode was clearly wrong, but as expected, it was a flashback to Brendok. But what we didn't know is that we were going to be left with more questions than answers. This one certainly expanded on the third episode, but was it enough? Considering this is the penultimate episode of Season 1, I've got to admit to you my dear friends, I don't think so. I'm going to explain my thoughts on this in more depth later in the breakdown. Despite some interesting symbolism and expansion of the Witch Coven, the second flashback doesn't deliver on its promises. There is no reason episodes 3 and 7 couldn't have been combined into one, and we're still left in the dark about so much. For one thing, there is the confusing situation with Torbin. Who would have thought the Jedi Padawan being homesick was going to be the cause for all of this? The episode brings a certain degree of tragedy to his later death. He was clearly too young for this mission and everything that went down. It wasn't expected, that wasn't why they were there. But what ended up happening left him scarred, traumatized and feeling guilty for the rest of his life. Again putting blame on the Jedi for bringing unprepared youngsters along for the unexpected. But my question is this. Why then did he go on to become a Jedi Master instead of just quitting the Order? Instead he takes the brash vow. Another point of contention we're going to explore in depth is Force Vergences, which Anakin was in The Phantom Menace, and despite the longer runtime for this episode, we still do not know who rescued May from Brendok. It was teased at the end of the third episode, at the end of the first flashback, she goes back to the tree. But who took her off-world? Who started her down the path of becoming an acolyte? So let's begin. We finally learn why the Jedi went to Brendok in the first place. Their mission, Kelnacca, Indara, Torbin, and Sol, was to find a vergence in the Force. This is described as a Force nexus, an unusual yet natural occurring concentration of Force energy around a place, a person, or an object. A vergence that is centered on a certain location could give nearby Force sensitives stronger interactions with the Force, often including visions. And in this discussion around the campfire, which is a callback to The Last Jedi, Kelnacca eating a Nuna is reminiscent of Chewie eating a porg. Indara reveals that Brendok was affected by the Great Hyperspace Disaster 100 years before the events of the show. If you're familiar with the High Republic books, in particular Light of the Jedi or Into the Dark, a Class A modular freight transport, the Legacy Run, was kicked out of hyperspace by a Nihil stormship. Parts of the Legacy Run were propelled throughout hyperspace and eventually back into real space too. This caused widespread disruption, and several planets and moons were destroyed. Brendok was catalogued by the Jedi as one of the planets affected, and yet it is teeming with life. So much so, the Jedi assumed there might be a vergence in the Force, which is why that team was there. But they're not going to find a vergence using metal detectors. That was a very strange creative choice. Look, I'm just being silly, but them weeding out Force sensitivity with these devices was a pretty peculiar aesthetic choice. Now it turns out the vergence is surrounding May and Osha. As I said, vergences don't have to be a location, but around certain individuals. In The Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon says, "I've encountered a vergence in the Force, a boy. His cells have the highest concentration of midichlorians I've seen in a life form. It is possible he was conceived by the midichlorians." And this ties to the prophecy of the Chosen One. So, a lot of fans are wondering, does this step on the toes of Episode 1? Does it make Anakin later in the timeline a bit less special? Well, that is certainly a valid criticism. And something I did find very frustrating in this episode is that they never address the Immaculate Conception, how the witches of Brendok went around manipulation of midichlorians, the creation of life. We suspected there is a connection to the Sith, but they never confirmed this. There are certain connections between the ways the witches can transform themselves into non-physical forms, possess others and manipulate their minds, and certain Force cults from Star Wars legends, but they never do flat out state if there is a connection to an external group, and how this random coven was able to achieve this, something which, as we've spoken about before, Darth Plagueis and Tenebrous couldn't. In fact, Plagueis trying to manipulate the Force is what led to the Force responding back and producing Anakin as a response, and he saw this as punishment. So how did they master these powers? Where did they get it from? I wish they would have shown us, because we'd love to know. May kind of alludes to sacrifice in the coven, which does point to some sorcery from Star Wars Legends, which I might get into in a separate video, what might have inspired the witches of Brendok. But I've got to say, a lot of this was a huge oversight. So then we learn the reason Sol felt guilty for all these years. It was a selfish mission because deep down he felt Osha was meant to be his Padawan. And yet, we find out from Torbin, May and Osha are symbiotes. One consciousness in two bodies. Again, it's never explained how the witches did it. I'm hoping and keeping my fingers crossed the final episode does tie it in, especially if we're getting some kind of mysterious, unexpected Sith connection. But on its own, the episode does raise a few eyebrows and doesn't give us anything concrete. I've got to say the fight between Kelnacca, or should I say Coral, who possessed him, versus Torbin and Sol was pretty badass, visually impressive, but I was hoping for more unique frames in this episode. So much of it was literally lifted from episode 3. I was hoping a lot more of it was going to show how episode 3 was deceptive, and there was a lot more context, but the context that was provided didn't actually answer much. And while I understand what Torbin went through was very traumatic, I don't see how that was the reason he took the poison, and why he said, "I've been waiting for you, May." There is absolutely a ton of guilt, but his response, after the brash vow, feels unwarranted. I understand 7 weeks as a Padawan away from Coruscant is overwhelming, but the fact that was the point of manipulation for Mother Anastasia to get inside his head just threw me off. That could just be me personally, but I really do believe Torbin should have had a better reason to want to go home. This would have made the writing in this episode so much better. Why didn't Mother Anastasia give him dark, haunting visions? Make him so scared he would do anything to go home, not just whisper to him like the witch in Narnia and overpromise. This is probably my biggest gripe in the episode. I once again feel as though, and you're going to say, Meg, you say this every single week, but it is so true. Li Jung-jae, the star of this episode, but it was also so great to see more Carrie-Anne Moss. Although when Sol wanted to confess to the council, she is the one who said, think about the consequences, think about what you're doing. So they twisted the truth, more cover-ups from the Jedi, this time to protect Osha, but also so that Sol didn't get punished. But now we have the interesting scenario in the next episode. We know May found out the truth from Sol because she's the one strapped into his ship, but if Osha finds out, she's going to be mad. And as I predicted, I think she's going to kill her former master. But when Chimera said to Sol that he was hiding his darkness, I don't think he intended to kill Mother Anastasia. It was in the moment. She was using witch magic, becoming some kind of dementor. All of the witches had their arrows at them. Coral was threatening Sol, but Sol makes it very clear he never intended to harm anyone. So while we were thinking there was a real deep darkness to Sol, which I was hoping they were going to explore, that's not how it comes across. Yes, he was in the wrong, but to my estimation, Indara also shared a good portion of the blame. And here's something to note. When Mother Anastasia started to use her magic and transform, she was taking May with her. Notice May starts to vanish too. Was she simply trying to protect her, transfer her essence into her, or something more? And did you notice the interesting bit of foreshadowing? Mother Anastasia predicting Order 66. She says someday those noble intentions you will have will destroy every Jedi in the galaxy. But here's a question. I wonder what happened to the spirit, the essence of Coral. Our theory she's still out there true. And one interesting Easter egg you may have missed is that Torbin is originally from Paupers on Bonadan. This is a planet referenced in Han Solo's Revenge, the same expanded universe book that gives us Basil's species, the Tainans, and I'm guessing Leslie Headland must have read it, because she seems to like including small details from it. It's a great book from a great trilogy. And then we see a different perspective of the Jedi test. Sol very much wanted to train Osha. When the blood tests come in, we find out just like Anakin, the midichlorian count is off the charts. But the council does not approve. They're too old for training. Nonetheless, Sol is adamant, and his selfishness and being driven by his emotions is part of the reason they end up in this situation. So, a lot of the blame is on Sol for what happened to his colleagues. But something that must be said. We've seen two perspectives, and a third, objective one is needed. There is still uncertainty concerning the fire. Did breaking the possession of Kelnacca alone kill Coral, or did she disappear? Is she possessing someone else? Is she going to emerge in the final episode? I'm still holding out for a big connection to the Sith, but this really should have been how they ended this episode. I think to our consternation and surprise, the big question marks are around May. I'm pretty concerned the final episode isn't going to be long enough to cover everything it needs to. Even if they do want to leave it open-ended for more seasons, we do need to get the bare minimum of answers. And I don't feel as though this episode, stated as the big second flashback to clarify things, succeeded to any meaningful extent. And if Sol has so much darkness and the Jedi were to blame, then why do they have May start the fire and the Jedi act in self-defense? Is that really the truth? Are they going to go back in the final episode and give us that third perspective? I think a lot of us expected much worse on the Jedi's part. One thing I do think deserves credit is the emotional complexity, because Star Wars is often so black and white. It was kind of interesting to get two false cults, both with blame, imperfections, but also a smidgen of humanity the audience has to consider. I've also got to admit I'm not the biggest fan of pop music being in the outro of a Star Wars episode. It's certainly not the first time we've had non-orchestral music in the franchise, but it feels a tad inappropriate. So those are my criticisms. That's everything I liked and everything I didn't. I try to keep it balanced. I've got to say, both flashback episodes have been the low points in my opinion in the season. I was really getting into it with 5 and 6, and I still hope for a good episode based on comments made by Manlis Stenberg for the final one next week. But what did you guys think? Share your thoughts in the comments down below. Did you enjoy this one? Why so? Or why not? And if you enjoyed this breakdown, please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and may the Force be with you, always.